Welcome. My name's Kathy, and before commencing, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we meet today. I recognise their diverse and ancient culture and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I extend my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here. Great. So today's very special guest is crime novelist Katherine Firkin. As a Melbourne journalist, Katherine has covered crime and court reporting and has been writing fiction from a very young age. Her first novel, Sticks and Stones, was released last year, and Katherine was one of our very first online author events of 2020. And we're really pleased to have her back joining us today for her second novel, The Girl Remains. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. It really does mean a lot. The first book came out sort of right in the middle of the big lockdown in Victoria, and this one's come out at a much better time, but I'm still loving the fact that Zoom's enabling me to be everywhere at once. It's really fantastic, and I appreciate people, giving me the hour of their time. It really means a lot.
We just love that you've come to join us as well too, and it's obviously a lot more easier for you to get to the Central Coast via Zoom than to come up via plane at the moment. I'd like to congratulate you on your second novel. So it's fabulous to see the return of Detective Emmett Corban in print. And could you set the scene for us by reading a short excerpt and giving us a brief overview of what it's all about?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you a very quick summary first, and then I'll read the opening prologue. Basically, The Girl Remains is all about a cold case that happened back in 1998. 3 teenage girls wandered off into the night for a little bit of mischief, I would say, but only 2 of them came back. And this sparks one of Australia's most baffling cases. Just what happened to this 15-year-old girl who effectively just sort of disappeared into the night. It's really confusing for detectives because the 2 girls that come back are really not able to tell them what happened that night. They're quite confused. They're quite scared. They think they might have heard someone out there in the night with them, but they're not sure. And so for detectives at the time, this is really quite a baffling case, and they just cannot seem to work out what happened to this poor girl. Then in the present day, we see human remains turn up on a beach around the same area where these girls disappeared. And this is where the book really kicks off, with my lead detective, Emmett Corban, trying to work out, are these human remains from that poor girl who disappeared into the night? And if they are, what on earth happened to her all those years ago? So I'll read the opening prologue. It is a few pages, so feel free to cut me off if it gets too long. But this was actually a scene I wrote right from the outset, probably a good 18 months ago, and it's barely changed a word, which is rare for me. I think I was in the zone when I wrote this bit, so hopefully you'll like it. Okay, so this is the prologue. The sound of a twig snapping from somewhere behind made the girls freeze. Did you hear that? Cecilia tugged on the back of Gypsy's shirt again. Someone's out here, with us. Stop being such a baby, Scarlett groaned from the front. It'll just be a fox or a wallaby. Probably only a possum, Gypsy agreed, brushing away the trembling hand that was resting on her left shoulder. She hoped her friend couldn't feel her own steadily increasing pulse. In silence, the trio continued along the sandy track, weaving their way through the native shrubbery, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of tea tree. For most of their journey, they relied on the dim light from the night sky to guide them, but at times, like now, it was pitch black, the dense canopy of moonar trees enveloping them in darkness. Ow! Gypsy let out a little yelp as she tripped over an exposed root. Shh, Scarlett hissed. We're almost there. Sure enough, the girls came to the sharp bend in the trail, which led down to Blairgowrie's notorious Coonya Ocean Beach. It was a magnificent stretch of coastline, punctuated by towering sandstone rocks and crashing waves, majestic but also deadly. Every summer they would hear tales of how the icy waters that rolled in from Bass Strait had taken the life of yet another naive tourist who had underestimated the strong tides and killer rips. But that night, the girls weren't worried about the dangerous coast. Instead, they were staying on higher ground, looking for the forked tree that would lead them to the clearing. Here it is, Scarlett whispered, running her hand over the papery bark. And we'd better hurry. It must be getting close to midnight. Pressing her lips together, Gypsy followed her friend, stepping off the track and making her way through the ever-deepening shrubbery. She did her best to ignore the increasing rustle of branches all around and the short, anxious breaths of Cecilia from behind. We found it, Scarlett gasped as the banksia bushes opened up, allowing the blood moon to bathe the girls in a dull red light. At the centre of the clearing, the ring of rocks they'd previously placed lay undisturbed, the inverted pentagram still hanging from the surrounding trees. Reckon our carvings have lasted? Gypsy motioned for her two friends to join her at the nearest moonar tree, where she traced her fingertips along the rough trunk until she found what she was looking for, the sharp etching of horned ears. In quiet synchronicity, the girls walked from tree to tree, completing a full lap of the clearing before gathering in the centre. We've arrived, Scarlett grinned. Welcome back to the Devil's Landing. A nervous rasp escaped from Cecilia's mouth. Gypsy shuffled from foot to foot. Should we get started? She felt herself anxiously eye the bag of supplies that Cecilia had reluctantly carried and now sat at their feet. From her jeans pocket, Scarlett pulled out a small knife, the one she'd stolen from her dad's fishing kit. She waved the blade. Who will do the honours? Cecilia turned away. Gypsy stared at the moon. This was her duty. She took the knife and crouched down, then pressed the blade firmly into the sandy ground as she moved around the rocks. Scarlett was first to step into the circle. The ritual has started, she whispered dramatically. Gypsy joined her. Cecilia hugged her arms to her chest, frozen. Will you hurry up? Scarlett snapped. I'm scared. I think we should leave. Give it a go. It'll be fun, Gypsy urged, reaching a hand. Beside her, she could sense Scarlett's anger building. Something's in the bushes. Cecilia's lips were trembling. I don't think we're alone. Why can't you stop making shit up? Scarlett snarled. Gypsy stepped out of the circle and reached for the bag. Maybe we should have a drink first? She pulled out a can of beer. Oh, it's all Dad had. Scarlett's eyes flickered between her friends, daring either of them to complain. The yeasty liquid hissed as Gypsy flipped the aluminium lid open. She took a small, tentative sip. Give it here. Scarlett marched over and gulped a mouthful. You get used to it. Try some, Cecilia. Gypsy waved her friend closer. From the corner of her eye, she saw Scarlett fumbling with a plastic sleeve. White pills. What was she doing? It'll help us relax, Scarlett winked at Gypsy, dropping the pills into the can and swirling it before passing it on to Cecilia, oblivious. Holding her breath, Gypsy watched Cecilia drink, chugging at the can awkwardly as though in a rush to get it over with. Don't finish it all, she heard the stammer in her voice, high-pitched, nervous. Yeah, give it back. Scarlett took another swig, leaving Gypsy to finish the dregs. She tossed the empty can to the side. Want to get the fire going? Yeah, but where's the kindling? Scarlett rummaged through the bag. Gypsy's mouth turned dry. I think I left it behind. You left it? I just forgot. Her friend glowered. Then you'll need to find some, quickly. In a panic, Gypsy delved back through the shrubbery, foraging for any sticks or dry grass that might help to start a fire. But the further she ventured from the clearing, the harder it was to see, and the black shapes around her became distorted, terrifying. Using the pocket knife, she hacked at nearby branches, her actions becoming increasingly frenzied, her mind playing tricks on her. Was Cecilia right? Was that a dark figure hiding in the bushes? Was that another? Was she surrounded? She must have been gone for at least a few minutes when her name was shouted several times. Then came the rustle in the bushes, the heavy breathing, her wild, swinging arm. But what happened next would forever remain a blur. In the coming days, Gypsy would tell police she'd heard a scream, a high-pitched wail that had risen through the night, so piercing that flocks of birds had jolted from their slumber and taken flight. She'd say she had no idea where her friends had got to, that she'd searched desperately for hours, only giving up when she'd become disoriented and lost. Of course, she wouldn't tell them about the devils that were carved on the trees, the magic white pills, or the rituals the girls had been carrying out. And she certainly wouldn't mention how she'd fled along the dirt track, hiding in the backyard of her friend's family home until first light, at which time she'd shakily turned on the garden tap, able to see just enough to make sure all the blood was washed from her hands. Da-da-da.
So you're a journalist by trade. and you've written and covered some high-profile criminal cases. How much did that influence you to start writing your crime novels?
Well, it was definitely a huge influence as far as choosing crime as the genre. I think I always wanted to be a writer, so I was always going to write whether I, became a crime journal or not. It was always something that I really wanted to do. But, my crime reporting definitely steered me in the direction where I felt confident that maybe I could take on this genre. It's quite a tricky thing when you start out plotting a crime novel because particularly in the type of books I write, I like to give enough clues that people can work out who's done it. They are real whodunit books. And that, of course, leaves you open to the risk of saying too much, giving away too much. So working out how to sort of drop some of those clues in took me a fair bit of time. But as far as actually choosing crime and feeling comfortable writing in crime, having some contact with police and working out those sorts of things, I definitely relied on my background as a journo quite a lot.
Yeah. And so your main characters, Emmett and Cindy, you can tell us a little bit about them. They're both driven in their careers, all the while raising their son, Nicholas. They bring a real personal element to the story, and it's refreshing to see them both stumble through marriage and parenting. How did you form these characters?
Yeah, so the opening I just read there, was focusing on three teenage girls who sort of disappear into the night and only two of them come back. That's really the scene setter for The Girl Remains. But the main character, as you mentioned, is Detective Emmett Corban. He's with Victoria Police. When we first met him in Sticks and Stones, he was working in the Missing Persons Unit. He's now moved on to Cold Case, and he is pulled into the investigation when human remains are found on the beach. He wasn't working as a detective when this case occurred in 98, but he's certainly very, very familiar with it. His wife, Cindy, who we also met back in Sticks and Stones, she's moved on a little bit in this novel as well. Her passion for photography, which we learnt about in the first book, has really blossomed, and it's taken on a whole new aspect for her. She's managed to pick up a bit of freelance work with the Australian Associated Press. So she's actually working as a photojournalist, just part-time. She's sort of desperately trying to pick up shifts here and there, which is very realistic for how the media works in Australia, unfortunately. There's a lot of freelancing these days, not a lot of full-time work. So she's desperate to get whatever shifts she can. But of course, that does prove there are a few tensions between Cindy and Emmett in this novel because she ends up actually covering the same story that he's investigating suspect. So they haven't left a trail of evidence. So for detectives, they have to take some fairly, unusual steps to try and shake this suspect into giving them enough evidence or at least enough suspicion that they could really actually arrest this person and put them into custody. This was something I actually took from a real life case. In fact, I had a look at a case that occurred back in 1991. My novel is set in 1998. This was a real life case about a girl called Cherie Beasley who disappeared on the Mornington Peninsula as well, where my book is set. And she vanished while riding her bicycle near a milk bar. And it was a horrific case similar to what I've written about, because when children disappear, it really shakes the community. And these towns on the Mornington Peninsula are small, they're quite tight-knit. Everyone thinks they know each other. So when a girl just vanishes, it of course sparks this sense of fear and concern. So I went back and had a look at this case, and similarly at the time, police thought they knew who had done it. They could not get this guy to crack. And they did some really fascinating things, like they secretly recorded this guy's therapy sessions and they followed him around surreptitiously and they planted people to try and befriend him and make him talk. And they did all these sorts of things to really try and get him to lead them to evidence. And I have certainly taken some of that in The Girl Remains. You'll see some of my detectives really trying everything they can, even if it sort of crosses into grey areas of the law, to try and get their suspect to talk.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? How do you keep your storylines under wraps, especially when you have friends and family asking you or asking for spoilers, or you're in social situations? How do you not let anything slip?
Yeah, it's tricky once I start talking about the book. I find crime difficult novels to speak about, because really all I can give you is that sort of blurb and that suggestion at the start. And then if I start giving you too much about the characters, quite often I give little things away that I don't want to give away early. So it is a tricky thing to sort of keep it under wraps. In my personal life, though, I'm very private with my writing. In fact, my husband hasn't even read this book yet. I don't let people see it until right at the end, because I don't know, I'm a bit of a fusspot and a bit sort of a perfectionist. And if I start showing things when I know they're not ready and I get feedback, I'm sort of like, I know it's not good yet, just let me be. So I kind of like to get to the end, show it to my publisher, maybe my agent. They're about the only people that will see it early on. And then once it gets to its finished state, I kind of open the doors and close my eyes and cross my fingers.
So what's your research process like then, if you don't have sort of friends and family weighing in? That's just a very solo kind of thing?
It is very solo, but I do make an effort with research. This is partly a procrastination thing and partly just a personal preference, that I try to go to people directly whenever I can. I don't do a lot of Google searching. I don't do a lot of delving through internet, because you can go down rabbit holes. I always try to actually find someone who's worked in that field or has, a direct involvement in something that I'm interested in, and just have a chat to them. I find those personal conversations, although they're time consuming, they result in so much information. And quite often when you get those relationships, like in this case, I had a detective that had worked on this Cherie Beasley case, that little girl I was talking about who disappeared. And he was so helpful, and he gave me some really good tips. And he actually helped shape the plot in many ways, which I wouldn't have got if I just started Googling things. He actually was like, have you thought of this? Have you tried that? Oh, wouldn't it be interesting if they found that, but they couldn't, and he was really great at sort of prompting me almost from a detective's point of view, what could happen. And I think that really adds something different to the novel that I'm really pleased with. The other aspect in The Girl Remains that I really had to research was the whole area of forensic anthropology. I do like my novels to feel real, and this is all about human remains turning up. So I did need to make sure I had at least some concept about what would police do if they find bone that they think is human. How is that testing process? How does that actually occur? And interestingly, what can they learn from the bones? What sort of secrets can human remains give away? I learned so much interesting stuff. In fact, I actually spoke to someone who'd worked at the World Trade Site Center after September 11, and they were directly involved in looking through human remains, which was, of course, just a horrific trauma on a massive scale. But they were able to give me, again, some really interesting clues about different things you can learn from bones, which I never realized, how much you can learn about dietary habits and sports injuries and a whole lot of different things just by looking at human remains.
Wow. So we had a question before the session started. It was a bit linked to your research and probably what you were just talking about. So which crime detail in the book took the most painstaking research? Would it have been around that kind of bone aspect of it? And as a result, were there any specific ideas that you had to kind of give up on because it was just taking too much research, or did you find a fantastical way to fit them in somehow? Or yeah,
it's a good question. I mean, again, I can't give too much away with things
without spoiling
that I popped into the book, but certainly that forensic anthropology side took longer than I was expecting. And to be honest, I didn't end up using a lot of the detail I learned in the book, but it helped inform the way the investigation rolled out. It's always tricky, particularly I love details, but it can weigh a book down if you get too much into the detail of how step-by-step things are going to work. So quite often with the research, it's something that I'll put into the back of my head, and just knowing it sort of shapes the way the plot moves forward. You don't necessarily need to tell the reader absolutely everything about how this particular field might work. But there were a couple of clues with human remains that I'd never thought of, that having a chat to them made me realize, I could put that in and that would link this, or, it would confuse people or whatever it is. So that was really helpful And the other aspect, same as with my first book, Sticks and Stones, that always takes longer than I think it will, is just making sure I get the police investigation right, that police will actually behave the way I suggest they're going to behave. You know, I do take creative liberties, but, I always want it to feel real. They do push boundaries in this book, and perhaps some people will think it couldn't happen, but I can assure you that everything that happens in this book could happen, because I've had detectives point me to cases where it actually has happened. But that's that old sort of saying that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. Quite often I hear stories and I think I have to tone it down because people won't believe that. So that's another sort of fun thing that I do after I chat to the detectives.
In terms of the way the book plays out, do you plot everything out before you actually start writing, or does it evolve as you're going through? Do you know at the beginning who did it, or how does that work?
I have a very strong feeling at the start about who did it. I don't think I'd be confident to start writing if I didn't know who my offender was, because my stories largely play on the motivation psychology side of things. They don't tend to be too violent graphically. You know, I don't spend a lot of time actually describing how someone is killed or the crimes. I'm more interested in why they've committed it, how they're trying to cover it up, how they're trying to live their life now. So for me, that motivation and knowing who did it from the start is very important. Otherwise, I'm not sure I would be able to get going. But I definitely don't plot most of the novel. Once I've got an idea of that opening scene, who did it, why they did it, I tend to just let my characters take me on a bit of a journey. And it's a bit of a scary way to write, because there are times when I'm like, I have no idea where I'm going. But it's quite fun as well, because sometimes you surprise yourself and your characters surprise yourself, and I'll turn around and think, oh, I would never have thought of that. That's very clever. Well done, Emmett, or whoever it is.
Are there plans for more stories with Emmett in them?
Yes, but I don't think it's going to be book 3. I'm actually right in the middle of a new manuscript, and it's completely different. And I don't know how much I can say about it, because it may or may not eventuate. I'm really, really excited by it. But it is a very different style. It's still crime, but it's all told from one person's perspective. It's all told in first person, present tense. It's more of a standalone psychological thriller. And I need to see how that plays out, whether that's going to be book 3 or whether I will continue with Emmett for book 3.
Oh, that sounds really exciting. Is it difficult to switch between novel writing and reporting?
Actually, I don't find the switch hard. I think I find being a journalist tougher many days, because I think what made crime writing so appealing to me at this point in my career was that so often I'm quite frustrated by what I put out on the news. We're so restricted in terms of time. You know, if you're talking about TV news, you get 1:30 to tell a story. In newspaper, you might get max 600 words. And in radio, you get like 30 to 45 seconds. So depending what medium I'm working in, I'll come out of a court case, and quite often I feel very frustrated that all I'm able to tell people at home is 38-year-old man was convicted of this and he's now going to spend 10 years behind jail, and that's sort of it. You never really get into who this person was, who the victim was, how they actually met, what their story was beforehand, you know, any of that. You never really get to flesh it out. So I don't have any issue switching to novel writing. It's more the other way for me. It's more sometimes I have some intense conversations with my editors at work about, I need more time. I need more in here, but that often doesn't happen.
Do you read a lot of crime fiction yourself, or is it once you've finished writing for the day, you want to switch off and get into something completely different?
When I'm really in the middle of writing a manuscript like I am right now, I really can't read a lot of other creative crime fiction. It's not that I want to switch off. I more have an issue that I start analysing it. It's almost like homework. Or I start comparing myself to it and worrying, you know, if I come up with if there's a really clever paragraph, I'll sort of think, oh, why didn't I think of that? Or there's a twist or something. And it almost starts to feel like a chore. When I'm not really, really intensely writing, I love it. and I read far and wide. But right now, I find I relax by reading nonfiction because it's different enough. I like reading memoirs and stuff. And quite often, I mean, I love looking at human psychology. So I find memoirs and nonfiction, quite often there's little quirky bits where I think, oh, I could probably, take something from this for a character, without fearing that I'm necessarily plagiarizing. Like when I'm reading a crime novel and I feel like this might actually end up in my book, which is not good.
Okay, well, that's all the questions that I've got. We do have one from the chat already, and if anyone else wants to drop anything that they're interested in knowing into the chat, we can go through some questions there. But we have one from Nanette that says she loved your previous book, which was set in Melbourne. Looking forward to reading the latest book, but curious to know why you chose Blair Gowrie as the setting. Is it familiarity or something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm really glad that you enjoyed the first book. It was interesting when I set Sticks and Stones in Melbourne, right in the city. I was really worried about what people would think because there's not many crime novels that are set in cities in Australia at the moment. They are all set out in the bush or the outback or by the sea. So I felt like I was taking a real risk with that one. But I sort of liked having a city detective. And my aim for Emmett Corban was always that he is going to be a city detective. And he still is in my mind for this one. I mean, one of the things that I looked at when I chose Blair Gowrie was I needed a location that was still close enough to Melbourne that realistically my detectives would go out there for day trips. And speaking to some of those detectives in real life, they absolutely would. If a crime like this happened in the sort of Mornington Peninsula region where the book is set, they would be using Melbourne-based homicide or cold case detectives, as well as using local resources. So I liked that I could still keep my detective Melbourne, but he goes out for day trips. And the reason I chose Blair Gowrie initially is because of familiarity. You're correct. I spent lots of childhoods down there with a friend. And in fact, it was probably the first place I went as a teenager without parents. And I think I felt like I had that real sense of, that mischief and excitement when you finally get rid of the parents when you're 14 or 15 or 16 and you're like, oh, yes. And you do go a bit crazy and a bit silly. And even if stuff you're doing is not particularly wild, we thought we were, but looking back, we probably were not that crazy. But, you have that sense of, oh, anything could happen. It's just us out here, And I like that idea of teenagers let loose because they're quite interesting characters to write, teenagers. I think they're great characters because quite often they live in these secret worlds that they don't even tell their parents. They're not really often telling any responsible adult, and quite often they're not even telling each other what they're really getting up to or who they're texting or who they're hanging out with. So it makes them quite unreliable witnesses. And that's certainly the case in this book. When detectives are trying to interview them at the start, the teenage girls really are a bit confused and they can't necessarily admit to the whole picture. And that, of course, really hampers the investigation to start off with. The other aspect of the Mornington Peninsula I like as a setting is that there are some really high-profile cases out that way. And so I was able to get a bit of direct research into the actual investigation part of it. And I always like trying to add that element of realism. So for me, it felt like an obvious fit for this story. But Emmett's not going to be a coastal detective, permanently. He's definitely based in Melbourne. And I think the third book here will be back very much city-based.
Very exciting. Do you, I know you do it you have your journalism side of things, and do you listen to or read a lot about true crime just for your own interest as well? So like true crime podcasts or anything like that?
I'm really interested in cold cases. I'm funny. Sometimes, I have to admit, I don't love crime that's particularly violent or, I'm not a big horror fan. So I don't listen to podcasts if they're overly descriptive. And I think that's only because I've spent too much time sitting in a courtroom myself and I've seen the victims and I've seen the victims' families, and I can never quite escape the feeling that this is real for people. And I always feel a slight sensitivity there that you I love writing crime because I love that exploring the darker side of human psychology and the real extremes of human behavior. But I don't necessarily love exploiting the actual trauma that people go through. And for me, there's a bit of a fine line. So to be honest, some of the true crime podcasts, I just personally find them a little bit gratuitous in nature. Some of them are fantastic. But I definitely love looking at cold cases because I think there's something really fascinating about what that trauma does when there's no resolution. It's really one thing I always say to people, is that these crimes never claim just one victim. There's always multiple people that are affected, and quite often they don't even realize they're affected until years and years later when different things start to show up. And so I think, from a creative fiction point of view, probably Emmett will stay in the cold case unit now because I love that idea of how trauma and grief sort of carries through the years. And I really love looking at real life cases in those sort of situations. And I also like looking at cases where the investigation maybe was hampered at the outset, and then it's up to detectives in the present day to go back and fix it. I just think that's such a mammoth task that they're given. And I find it fascinating how they go about that process.
No, I think about reading those old cold cases. It's like, imagine if you found a key part of evidence that suddenly solved it and it was just sitting there that whole time.
That's exactly right. And I think, so often the detectives are so motivated by that sense of justice and trying to do the right thing for the family. I find that aspect really quite interesting and quite rewarding to read about.
Yeah. Okay, well, is there any other questions that want to, oh, here we go, we've got some more. This one's from Daniel. Could you please clarify the prologue? That is, how is relevance embedded into the protagonist's investigation, or if it quickly loses relevance due to other crime spots and red herrings? Is it a real location with a reputation for teens and occult rituals? And then the next part is, how often in your journalistic career do you run into this kind of crime, I suppose?
Yeah, so the prologue is really, doing what a prologue should, I think, and that's just setting the scene for the reader that this is what happened back in 1998. These 3 teenage girls disappeared into the night, and straight away you learn that there's a bit of tension between the 3 of them. They're a bit niggly. Maybe something's happened that's made them a bit uncomfortable with each other. There's the suggestion of drugs. There's suggestion of some sort of, spell casting or, something a bit weird going on. So all of that is very, very relevant to the story. This book, unlike Sticks and Stones, I don't spend a lot of time sitting back in the past. I think 99% of this book is told in the present day. So this is about the only glimpse. You do get a couple of glimpses later on. This is one of few glimpses into the past that you get where you can see the girls in their teenage years and you get a sense of what actually happened that night. After that, it becomes a lot of witness accounts and speculation and things. So I've sort of given the reader a bit of a clue right from the start about the state of the girls as they went out that night and what actually happened. I think the prologue in this book is very important. And it's something that probably the reader will reflect on as the book progresses. There are a few other little hints of the past later on, but there's not many. It's not like Sticks and Stones where you really get into that past. This one, I've given fewer clues as to what actually happened from the outset. So this prologue is very, very important. The area where I'm describing is a real location. There's nowhere called the Devil's Landing. This is just what my characters had dubbed it. I certainly think, teenage girls back then were probably heading out and doing a few silly things around that area from not myself personally, but I'm aware of this particular area. I don't know if spells and magic were necessarily involved, but that's where my creative, my imagination came in. But you can definitely take this book and walk around Blairgowrie, and you could probably use it as a guidebook. Like, it is very much, I've described streets and locations, and this particular clearing is very much there if you were to rustle through the bushes and try to find it.
And yeah, have you run into this kind of thing before in any of your journalistic endeavours?
I've certainly run into the sort of unreliable witness situation where police are quite frustrated because the only people who've seen what happened or maybe saw what happened are difficult witnesses for different reasons. Not so much, I mean, I haven't necessarily had, this sort of heading out into the night and only two coming back, but I've certainly had enough direct experience with police sort of saying how frustrating it is when something's happened and the only people that can tell them for whatever reason, whether it's trauma or something else, aren't sharing all the information.
Okay, this one's from Nanette. Quite a lot of Australian crime books are being made into movies. I'm just wondering if you had thought about which actor would play Detective Emmett and which could do him justice.
Yeah, I need to have an answer to this question because I don't really have an answer. I need to go and have a think about that because a lot of people at the moment are asking me this question. I would love to see this series made into like a local TV drama. I love Australian drama, and I think it could actually be done really, really well. And because all the settings in the books so far are real and they're all still standing, it wouldn't actually be such a difficult thing for a production company to take on. But I'm trying to think who would play Emmett. In my head initially, I had sort of a young, maybe 10, 20 years ago, Ewan McGregor type guy, but I'm not sure if that's the way readers see him. Quite a few people seem to picture him almost, sort of sandy brown, tall, lanky. A lot of people, I've deliberately always kept my descriptions of Emmett quite vague so that he is as you want to see him. So maybe it's better if I ask readers who they would like to be in the movie.
I kind of pictured a bit of a Simon Baker actually, with that kind of, I guess because he's Australian as well, but after having watched him in The Mentalist, I don't know, I got kind of that vibe, but maybe that was just me.
I could actually see that. Yep.
Yeah. Nanette said maybe Sam Worthington as well.
Oh, yes.
He's
yes.
good.
I don't know if that's maybe giving Emmett a bit too much credit, but I do like that suggestion. I'll need to contact their agents and try and push this
Get
on.
that locked in. And Kathy said, can you tell us a little bit about Pippa?
Oh, yeah. So in the blurb, I've got to be careful what I say with Pippa. We learn that there is a mysterious woman who has come to town and she is there to try and find her own version of justice. And that's all we know. We learn that this mysterious woman is Pippa. She has appeared in town. She seems to be quite transient. She doesn't necessarily seem to have a lot of future plans, or her reason for being there is quite unclear, and I'm struggling to say much without giving things away. She is a very crucial part of the story though, and her appearance is partly fortuitous timing with the human remains appearing, and it's partly quite calculated. And I don't know what else I can say without destroying it, but if you've read it, I'd love to know what you... Oh, I don't even know if I should ask that because it might ruin it for other people. All I'll say is that I think Pippa is a very important character. I loved writing Pippa because she's a little bit flawed like a lot of my characters, and she's a bit desperate, but her motivations are very strong. And I think she's she was a very interesting character to write, a little bit reckless. And I like writing characters that are a bit reckless.
Would you say she is the favourite character that you've written across the two books, or is Emmett always going to win out because he's...
No, actually, my absolute favourite character to write from was still in Sticks and Stones, was the little boy perspective. I really, really enjoyed writing as a little boy, and I don't know if that means I should be writing children's books, but I found it really quite freeing to see the world quite simplistically. But just to look at the way, you know, a child might see things, I think it's really quite fascinating, and the way they process it, and they're constantly explaining things to themselves. And what I like writing about from a child's point of view is they have such little information to sort of go on. You know, they've only got a few years to look back on and try and put things into place. So for them, you know, depending on the childhood they've had, the way they process information is quite different from the way we look at things. And I found that really quite fun to write from. There was also a character who was only really a sideline character in Sticks and Stones, Samir. He lived in the Flemington Commission flats, and he got into a little bit of trouble. And I loved writing from his perspective too, because he was, you know, a little bit of a troublemaker as well, but also a little bit misunderstood. And I think those sorts of characters are quite fun because you can get away with a lot more.
On the flip side, do you have anyone that you really struggled or really didn't enjoy writing, or just wanted to make everyone else hate them? Besides, you know.
I think I would have trouble writing characters that are really dislikable. You know, I know some books do very well when they've got a protagonist that's very, very flawed. But I find people that are personally, as a reader, when I read books and the protagonist or the main characters are just too flawed, I actually get quite frustrated. And I sort of think, why am I investing my time in you? You know, get it together. So I don't think I could ever write characters that I didn't like in some form. Like, all my characters, I think, have redeeming qualities. The character I think that's actually most polarizing is Cindy. Quite a few people tell me at the end of this book that they hate her, which I find interesting because I quite like Cindy. I mean, she makes lots of mistakes, and she's, you know, sometimes she does a few questionable things. But to me, she's very human, and she's doing the best she can in the situation she's in. So I really like her, but I find it interesting that quite a few people say to me at the end, they're like, oh, I hate her.
It's funny how, yeah, you've got a view in your head, and then anyone can bring anything that they have to the book and form their own opinion. We've got another question. Which crime novelist inspire you the most? Do you binge watch any crime shows, or do you now avoid them? So we kind of talked a little bit about that before. Due to you being the over analytical.
Yeah, I definitely have to say that I've been really trying to support Australian crime since my first book came out, particularly coming out in the middle of the pandemic. It was not an ideal time to be launching a book, and I became really aware how important it is to try and support local authors and local bookshops and things. And I've been really pleasantly surprised by how good so much Australian crime is. Because up until that point, I was obsessed with Scandi crime, and I still am to some degree. I'm weird. I read almost all Australian crime now, but every so often it's like I have this addiction. I just need to quickly read something set in Sweden or Denmark and kind of get it out of my system. And then I go back to the Australian crime. There's something about that Nordic crime genre that I really like. It just hits me differently to everything else, and I'm not sure what that is. But authors like Camilla Lackberg and those sorts of, I think she's Swedish, there's something about the darkness of the crime and the sort of domesticity and the lightness they inject through their settings. I love it, I have to say. I'm obsessed with it. And I love that a few people have said the cover of this book too looks a little bit Scandi. I'm like, yes, that's good.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have something that you're reading right now?
Actually, I'm reading Emotional Female. So that's that non-fiction. Yeah, talking about, you know, sexism and all sorts of things in medicine. So it's completely different, but it's very good.
Okay, well, I think that's all of our questions that we've gone through now. If anyone else has anything last minute that they want to add in, otherwise we'll finish up. No, there's been a lot of questions come through, so Well, that concludes our presentation for today. I just want to thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you the best with your book tour. We do have a few copies of Sticks and Stones available in our libraries, and The Girl Remains on order, so watch out for that soon. And also check out our ebook versions of it. But if you do want to purchase your own copies, please consider one of our local independent booksellers on the Central Coast. I know they would love to have you in. But thank you everyone for joining us. Remember to visit our What's On page to find out what's next on our library calendar. And next week we do have Amanda Hampson coming in via Zoom too. If you have any questions or feedback, please feel free to email us at librarypromotional@centralcoast.nsw.gov.au. But yes, thank you so much. It's been so lovely to talk to you and so interesting to hear about all your different characters and your process. Thank you.
Right, and thank you again to everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Hopefully there'll be book 3 next year and we can do it again.
Yes, definitely. That would be amazing.
Bye, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.